Good morning. Good to see this number out. So thankful for the presence of everyone. Amen. All right, before we continue in Lesson 7, which is the beginning of 2 Samuel, let's run through the 17 time periods again. So before the flood, the scattering of the people, the patriarchs, the Exodus, the wandering in the wilderness, invasion and conquest of Canaan, the judges, the united kingdom, the divided kingdom, Judah alone, the captivity, return from captivity, years of silence, the life of Christ, early church, and the letters to the Christians. So we, as I mentioned, are into 2 Samuel now, which will, the entire book of 2 Samuel will be over David. And we see more connection now with the stories over in 1 Chronicles. So we'll be in 1 Chronicles 11 through 29. And then as we close out or get close to the end of David, we'll pick up with Solomon. Of course, Solomon kind of comes up in the story with our lesson 8 with the building of the temple, and that will be in 1 Kings 1 through 11 and 2 Chronicles 1 through 9. So this morning we are going to be beginning with question 3, which is over 2 Samuel 2. And it says, contrast the leadership of David and Ishbosheth. How did their leadership impact the people and the kingdom? And how can we apply the lessons of leadership, loyalty, and conflict resolution from 2 Samuel in the context? So we mentioned this last week. We are in the time period of the United Kingdom, but we are actually in a period of the kingdom being divided. So we had talked about last week David being anointed king of Judah, and so you've still got this conflict between David and the family of Saul, even though Saul is no longer there. So you've got Saul's son Ishbosheth, who is somewhat ruling over Israel. So just contrast the two there, and what can we learn from the two and the contrast there. Clarissa?
Well, David was a true king, an anointed king of God. He had all the proper qualities as a leader that we've already seen so far as being brave and commanding, and he was just, and most importantly, he was faithful to God. Ishbosheth, whatever his name is, was basically the opposite in all of those qualities. He was almost Abner's puppet to maintain maybe his power over the people. So he had no real power, kind of as you alluded to.
So with David, obviously the key thing that we have to recognize, what Clarissa said there, in 2 Samuel 2 verse 1, he seeks God's guidance before making a decision. We see again, actually it'll be in our next lesson, but in 2 Samuel 5 and verse 19, he again seeks God's counsel before getting into battle. We see it multiple times that he is going to God, trying to get counsel, and because he wants to be faithful to God in everything that he does. And so the fact that he is leading based on God's guidance is super key. But one of the other things that I think we see with kind of a contrast between David and Ishbosheth is when David is in the wilderness, and he's got, of course, men that are coming to him. But what we see with David is this ability to unite a group of people. And with Ishbosheth, I think it's quite the opposite. And yeah, as Clarissa mentioned, I would consider him more of a puppet king, just because of the control there of Abner in 2 Samuel 2, 8, and 9. Abner places him as king. But Ishbosheth doesn't really have a great ability to inspire confidence in anybody, really. And so his leadership is more like a power dynamic, I guess, where they're trying to hold on to Saul's family and his power through Ishbosheth. And obviously it does not work ultimately. Francis?
His only leadership or only reason that he was even chosen was because of his family. He didn't have anything. If he had just been somebody out there, he had no qualifications.
Yes, definitely. One of the things that I think we recognize with David and the difference between the two So we're going through different godly characteristics of men and women with our young men and our young women, which we'll do again today. But last month's, one of them was integrity, and I think that that is something that we see very much so with David, that his leadership was one that was based on integrity, that was based on wisdom, and that's obviously something that we need to recognize, that we should, in anything that we do, we should have these characteristics. And with conflict resolution, what's one of the things that we can see with that? We'll kind of get into this a little bit more in our next question, but what do we see with David and Ishbosheth? Lena?
Well, I see that each one of them has like a favorite man or a leader man. Abner for Ishbosheth and Joab with David, and we see that there's a battle between the men. But when Ishbosheth confronts Abner for something he apparently didn't do, then he backs down because the Bible says he feared Abner. When Joab kills Abner because he thinks it's right to revenge for his brother, David doesn't go with his decisions, and David punishes him because he believes in the justice the right way.
Yeah, I think that one of the things that I would attribute to David is he's very diplomatic in how he handles resolution and conflict. And if you think of even going back to Saul, which obviously that would be Ishbosheth's kind of example for how to lead, but it's more we're going to win by power or by might, or the fact that I'm the king, and David doesn't necessarily do that, and he reigns more with grace and negotiation oftentimes, and not just simply going to battle. And yeah, there's a lot of power struggle between the main characters that we see with, as Lena said, with David and Joab, and then Ishbosheth and Abner. Yeah, we'll get to that a little bit more and a couple other questions. Norm, did you have something?
I was just pointing to Len.
I was talking to Norm P. Sorry, I should have clarified.
Another one.
The other Norm.
It's who he talks. His conflicts, as David compared to Saul, David's kind of more the conquering king. Saul was very much on the defensive, just trying to keep Israel together from invasion. David goes out and conquers territory, adds to the kingdom a lot, and is very successful in that. But it's always against those that are outside of Israel. Every time it's within Israel, he takes an absolutely different approach to both his stance, his outlook, his attitude, all of it. And it's militarily similar to what Christians do. We're at war with those that are outside. And it's the mindset of we've got to go out and bring more in to increase what the church has. But inside, we can't be at war with our brother. And just that, it's a very physical dynamic that David is showing here, but then God calls him a man after his own heart. And this is the time period where that's true.
Yeah, and we see that all the way back with his dealings with Saul, obviously. He had no desire to be at war with Saul or have conflict with Saul. And of course, a lot of that is based on his faithfulness to the Lord. Let's go ahead and do number 4. Why does Abner seek to make a covenant with David in 2 Samuel 3:12 through 21? And what does this reveal about David's approach to leadership and conflict resolution, as we just alluded to? And what lessons can we apply to our own relationships and conflicts? So Lena talked about this. So Abner had been accused by Ishbosheth of what? All right, so a relationship with his concubine, which would in that time would symbolize what? If that happened. Yeah, it's a power play of now I'm basically trying to take over. So Abner obviously took this personally, and while I think that's the genesis of why he's going to David, what else do we recognize, or what else does Abner we see that he recognizes about David?
He's going to be king.
Yeah, I think that Abner has this realization that David is the one that is going to be king. And so he comes to David to make this agreement. And what do we recognize about David and how he handles this specific situation? Norm?
It's like the politician that's willing to negotiate with anybody to get the job done, you know, kind of a thing here. Yeah, even though Abner has been, you know, opposed to him on the other side politically, he sees an opportunity to, David sees an opportunity to resolve, to reconcile the two sides. Sometimes you see it in the strangest places, or the least likely of places.
Yes. Yeah, I think that there's probably a bit of Abner obviously seeking his own safety, maybe, I don't know, but he's obviously recognizing things aren't going as well as what he would like with Ishbosheth, and so he's recognizing that David is going to be the true king, and I think he's trying to set himself up, maybe not necessarily to have any kind of power, but maybe even just save his life, to have this alliance and letting David know that, hey, I can bring all of Israel to you. And again, David, just because of his diplomatic approach, obviously is recognizing the benefit of this and ultimate desire to get the people all back together to have this true united kingdom. Anything else on number 4? April?
In connection with Abner's recognition of David going to be king, when he's speaking in verse 18, he says, "For the Lord has spoken to David, saying, by the hand of my servant David, I will save my people Israel." And so it seems like he recognizes that this is God's will as well.
Yes, definitely. Norm?
This idea of being a peacemaker, how do you do that when you have parties that just don't get along? Well, you have to start with talking. You have to start with being willing to go where the conversation is leading you, and go to the people that are willing to talk, and you have to start there. And you still may, as far as it depends on you, be at peace with all men, but and you may not be successful, but you definitely will not be successful if you're not out there opening the conversation.
Yeah, it's interesting because what do we know about David? And we'll talk about this in our next lesson, but why was he not able to, or why did God not want him building the temple? He's a man of war, and he was, but I mean, like Norm says, we have multiple situations where he's not using power or might to do things. He's using conversation, just having these conversations and trying to avoid some of that as well. And obviously, I think that is something definitely for us to recognize in our approach to conflict with different ones. As Norm said, to be at peace with all men, as much as it depends on us, and some of that comes just because we need to be more open and talking to others. Todd?
Yeah, he's a man of war against the Lord's enemies and not against the Lord's people. And it's that man after God's own heart. He's focused on what is God's will, and he's the shepherd of Israel. And so it kind of gets to your next question, but he doesn't make any actions against the people of God. And yet he rises to power, showing that it's God's will.
Yes, absolutely. Let's go ahead and get number 5. Consider 2 Samuel 3, verse 1. What factors contribute to the growth of David's house and the decline of Saul's house during this time? And what does this passage teach us about God's sovereignty and the rise and fall of leadership and kingdom? So 2 Samuel 3:1 says, "Now there was a long war between the house of Saul and the house of David, and David grew steadily stronger, but the house of Saul grew weaker continually." Norm?
Again, we see the sign of a true leader here with David, in that the reason he gained more and more popularity is people became more and more loyal to him, based on the character of the man and the things that they saw, and that kind of thing just grows and grows. Whereas, again, opposite character, opposite things to look at, the loyalty naturally is decreasing. There's nothing there that displays leadership, and So there's nothing to be loyal to.
So with these two in particular, with David and Saul, or the house of Saul, what's the major contrast? Why is one rising and one falling? It's all about their obedience and their faithfulness to God. And leaders are going to be accountable to God. Obviously, God is going to be able to make happen whatever His will is, regardless of what other things are going on. But God's expectation is that when He puts you in this position, that you're going to be faithful to Him, and your success or your failure is going to be tied to that. And that goes all the way back to the beginning. Everything that God expects is, or the blessings or the cursings, it's all based on obedience to Him. And I think that one of the things, and we've talked about this, how difficult of a time it was for David to actually get to this point. And that's God, of course, continuing to work His will. And regardless of how we may view it, and the expectations that we may have, or the plans that we may have, it's still going to be God. And one of the things that I was just thinking about even recently, obviously we are a very divided country, and I think it goes back to, ultimately the Lord is King, and that's who we serve, and that's what we need to be focused on, and that's what David was focused on, and again, that's the reason that he was continued to be strengthened. It was all because of the Lord and because of his faithfulness to the Lord. Miss Shirley?
David told Abner that he wouldn't talk to him unless he brought back his wife to him also.
Yeah. What do you think about that?
Well, ultimatum.
It what?
It was an ultimatum.
Yeah.
You do this or that.
Yeah, I don't really know for sure what the purpose of that was. I don't know that it was necessarily, it was some form of negotiating tactic, but I think that his ultimate thing was to try to bring the people together. But one of the things that we recognize about David is, I think one of his flaws was his concubines and his wives. We see that in this lesson, also in the next lesson as well. And he brought Michal back. I don't think that she did a whole lot for him. Question number 6. After Abner's death, David publicly mourns and condemns the act of murder. What is the significance of David's reaction to Abner's murder, and what does it tell us about justice and the importance of maintaining moral integrity as a leader? So he, of course, as we've discussed, is responsible for bringing this treaty, so to speak, to David. And, of course, as Lena brought out, you've got Abner and Joab, so you've got the leader somewhat of Ishbosheth and Saul's army, and then you've got Joab with David's army. And, of course, they had their own conflict. And even after David had made this agreement, Joab then takes it upon himself to take care of Abner. So what's the significance, though, of how David handles this situation, his reaction to it? Miss Shirley?
Well, he was horrified, and he vowed Joash's family would be there at the bank forever.
Okay. Say it again, Miss Shirley.
He was horrified that he'd killed Abner, and he vowed Joash's family would bear the blame forever.
That Joab's going to bear the guilt of his own actions, and that he was horrified by what had happened. Todd?
I kind of think of what happens in American politics, where something happens, and then one set of media will tell you, well, here's why the president did this, and the other side of the media will say, no, here's why he did that. Everybody's got their spin, and David basically makes sure that everybody knows exactly where he stands, so that nobody can say, oh, see, he was against Abner and Saul's house all along. He goes straight to the people, right, so that they can know where he stands. It's a great lesson for leaders. There should be no ambiguity on where you stand.
Yeah, if if you've got two sets of people, obviously he's already appointed as king over Judah, and then you've got the situation where now Abner was going to bring Israel to him. This could have totally blown up in his face, depending upon how he handled the situation. But it's very, very clear in chapter 3, in verse 35, it says, "Then all the people came to persuade David to eat bread while it was still day. But David vowed, saying, 'May God do so to me, and more also, if I taste bread or anything else before the sun goes down.' Now all the people took note of it, and it pleased them, just as everything the king did pleased all the people. So all the people and all Israel understood that day that it had not been the will of the king to put Abner the son of Ner to death." So just like what Todd was saying, he wanted to make sure, and he wasn't doing it for show. I mean, obviously this is truly who David was, and we know that from his character. But it was something that because of this act and the remorse that he had over what had happened to Abner, it really solidified Israel under David's rule. And I think that, again, we see David prioritizing justice and integrity over anything else. Because, I mean, ultimately, Abner had been an enemy of David, and yet typically when we think of our enemies either dying or, something happened to them, we're not going to mourn the way that we see David mourning. So it does, again, show his true character and the importance of condemning wrongdoing, even if it might strengthen our own position. Let me get my dad and then Norm.
I think when David was anointed, he of course, as years passed, he understood he was anointed king over all Israel. And he was still trying to do God's will and everything that he done. So he wanted justice not only for Judah, but for Israel too, because he knew at some point there was going to be one nation.
Yes. Norm?
It's a great example of righteous anger and how you apply that principle, that biblical principle, to the actions. You've got, it's doing the right thing, and that trumps going over the emotion. The anger is the emotion. Righteous anger, that's doing the right thing in response to that emotion. David was great at that. I mean, he was, and like you said, the action that ultimately came out of it was you knew where he stood, and it was always on God's side. It was it was the right thing to do, no matter who the person was that he's applying it to.
Yes.
No favoritism or partiality there.
Right. Francis?
Even though people have felt the way that Abner dealt with all this, these other people were avenging that. They weren't doing it for any other reason. So they actually went in and killed an innocent man because they felt like it was justified. Well, David was showing everybody, no matter who you are, there is a right way to do things.
Yes. So, just continuing on with this kind of similar thought, even though this may have strengthened his position, he obviously was going to condemn it. Question number 7, how does our text in 2 Samuel 1-4 reflect on the concept of ends justify the means? And what can we learn from our text regarding how we might be expected to react in a situation where an unethical act benefits ourselves? And so, all the way back in 2 Samuel chapter 1, so the Amalekite who came to David and claimed to have killed Saul, what could have the benefit of that been to David? Pretty obvious, Norm.
Yeah, the guy that's been trying to kill you for the last X number of years is gone. Yeah, thank you very much. No, he didn't. He had just the opposite.
Yeah, so obviously that's an act that, it really did benefit David in a sense. It kind of hastened his ascension to the throne and eliminates someone that is actively trying to kill David. And then similarly, like we just talked about with Abner's murder, even though it could have secured David's reign, because, he had been an enemy, of course it is publicly condemned. And so both of these acts David recognizes as unethical, regardless of how it may have benefited himself. He recognizes it's not justified. And so just thinking about this, I think about our own lives, and I think about our kids. I think about the college kids, our kids at school. And, there are times when Maybe it's either on a quiz or on homework or on a test where somebody's going to slip you an answer, and it's like, you know what? I was really struggling, and this actually is going to benefit me. Maybe I'm, on borderline of, getting whatever grade I need to get, and maybe you didn't even necessarily ask for it, but now here it is in front of you. What do? And I know just in my line of work, obviously most of my work is bid work, and there are opportunities out there where things can happen that are extremely unethical that will benefit you and ultimately could get you a job. And I know it's in other areas of our life as well, but this is real things that we are faced with, that we're confronted with, and how are we going to handle it? Things that can benefit us, and you know what? Nobody may ever even know. So how do we handle those situations? Sam?
How both of these, I guess the situation with David and how we as Christians, how this is related, is that David trusted that no matter what he would do, God would make sure that he would be the king, and that Israel would eventually be, unified under him. And he trusted that. Likewise, we read that God makes these promises to us on how he will be the avenger, how it belongs to him only and not to us. And he makes us these promises that if we seek the kingdom of God, that all these other things will be added unto us. Do we believe that enough to really practice what we preach and what we read, or do we not trust God enough to let him do that? Because if we take matters into our own hands, just like we've read with Israel in the past, shows that we aren't faithful enough to God to trust that he's going to do what he said he would.
Right. This ends justify the means. I mean, it's something that we see even within the church. We see it used as an excuse, really, to do certain things that we don't have authority for within the church, and it's because, but we're doing this good, and so that's even taking it a step further than maybe necessarily just benefiting us, but we're doing this good, and it may be benefiting a group of people, and so to the ends then, the good that is being done, can then we just do whatever we want to get to that point as long as good is happening? No, obviously not. And obviously, this can kind of help lead us to our next lesson because we talk about Uzzah, and it's like, I mean, he was literally just trying to keep the ark from falling to the ground. Seems like a pretty good thing, right? And obviously, he paid the ultimate price. And so I think that ultimately we have to have the mentality of I'm not going to compromise. I'm going to have this moral integrity that we see David have. And that we're going to value righteousness and faithfulness and truthfulness over expediency. And we see that shown with David very much so here in the beginning of 2 Samuel. Anything else on number 7? Go ahead, Todd.
In the affairs of men in every kingdom, a change of power from one family and dynasty to another is always accomplished through bloodshed, right? We can see that all the way through the Bible, and you see that in the Roman Empire and everywhere else. But David, as we've mentioned, has this focus on God. And it's very, very Christ-like, where Jesus said to Pilate, "My kingdom is not of this world. If it was, my servants would rise up and fight for me." And David has that mindset all along. Even though he has a kingdom that is of this world, he sees it as spiritual. It's what God is giving. So he's not interested in fighting to get his power.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I think when these things happen to us, it's because where's our focus? It's on this life. And it's like, okay, well, I'm in school, and this is stressful, and I want to be able to get this grade, and I want to be able to get this job, and so this is going to be okay. And we we lose focus on the eternal, which is what we should be focused on. And I'm going to make decisions. It may not benefit me now, but it's sure going to benefit me in the end, and that should be our focus. And I think that was David's focus, is trying to always be pleasing to God and not do things that were just beneficial to him in the here and now. Anything else on, who you pointing at, Norm? I don't know who we're pointing at. Oh, go ahead, Mama. Sorry.
I've been covered.
Okay.
How much David was like Jesus.
Yeah, of course, I quit asking this question, but I could have continued to ask this question in every lesson that we have had, the comparison to David, to the anointed, and I don't think that that's unintentional. I think that's very intentional, and we'll talk about it some more even with lesson 8 and some of the things that we see with David taking over. But yes, David is such an example or a tie to Christ for sure. Anything else on lesson 7? All right. So lesson 8, question 1. After David is anointed king over Israel, he and his men go to take Jerusalem from the Jebusites, even though the Jebusites thought there was no way David could take it from them. How was David able to succeed in the battles in chapter 5? And then in 2 Samuel 5:7, we see it called the city of David and called Zion for the first time. What's the significance of it being called Zion? So we see a continuation kind of David's attitude. And so how is he able to have these victories? All right. So just there in chapter 5 and verse, of course, we know that he had consulted God, but then also in 2 Samuel 5 and verse 19, it says, Then David inquired of the Lord, saying, Shall I go up against the Philistines? Will you give them into my hand? And the Lord said to David, Go up, for I will certainly give the Philistines into your hand. And verse 23, when David inquired of the Lord, he said, You shall not go directly up, circle around behind them and come to them. And so David is continuing to inquire of the Lord as he takes his steps. And so despite maybe the confidence of the Jebusites, David is going to succeed because God is with him, and David is continuing to consult God and inquire of God. So what's the significance of Zion? So Jerusalem's now the city of David, and Jerusalem is called Zion now for the first time. And what's the significance of this? Go ahead, Todd.
One of the interesting things is that he does this, as he's consolidating the whole nation of Israel, where this was a perfect choice for their capital, where Hebron was the capital somewhat of Judah. He doesn't want to be seen as Judah's king also ruling over Israel, and so he chooses a place that has never been conquered before. It goes all the way back to the days of the judges, where the Jebusites always had this land. And so he goes in and he takes it and makes it the capital of all Israel.
Okay. Norm?
It was saying that, in research that I had done, it said that Zion has no, like the meaning of it is like an unknown thing, but it became this spiritual and physical focal point. Physical for Israel, spiritual for us. This idea of the city on the hill, the highest place in the area was where the city was, and like Todd was saying, the wisdom of David, in following God's lead in here, in being able to pick something that you could visually see it as a central point of the faith of Israel, the faith in God, and all of that, and it's used that way spiritually throughout the rest of the Bible.
Yes. So although this is the first mention, obviously we know that it's going to be mentioned multiple times, and it takes on more of significance as we go further in Scripture. But the Lord promises to establish His king in Zion in Psalm 2 and verse 6. Out of Zion will go forth the law and the word of the Lord, Isaiah chapter 2 verse 3. Everyone who is in Zion will be called holy, in Isaiah 4, 3 through 5. The Lord of armies reign in Zion, Isaiah 24, verse 23. And it will lay a precious cornerstone in Zion as a foundation, Isaiah 28, verse 16. And so we've got a lot of prophecies that are connected to Zion. but what else do we see in the New Testament as far as in reference to Zion? Daddy?
Representative of the church in Hebrews chapter 12 and verse 22, a few verses there talks about it. He refers to that in verse 23 as to the General Assembly and Church of the Firstborn. After referring to it, what Brother Norm talked about it, she will come to Mount Zion, unto the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem. Revelation chapter 14 verse 1 refers to it as well.
Yes. So, as Norm said, there's a lot of physical things, and as Todd said too, with Jerusalem and Zion, there's a lot of spiritual application for us. And ever since going through this, I can't get the song out of my head. So I should have got with whoever's leading singing and said, hey, we need to sing that song. But obviously it has a lot of significance for us, and I think of it, we'll talk about the promises that are made to David here in this chapter, and again, just this start of Zion is such an important thing and significant thing within Scriptures, starting right here in 2 Samuel. Anything else on number 1? Norm?
And we can't overestimate the importance of the symbolism here. I mean, when the Bible talks about going down to some place or going up to some place, they're talking about going up a hill or down a hill. Like we talk about north and south, going down south, or it was a physical thing that they could see and visualize. And so when you talk about having a city on a hill, and when you talk about God, heaven, and the New Jerusalem, and all these things, I mean, they could literally see physical, things that they could look at and picture in their mind what God was talking to them about. It's just a beautiful, beautiful way that God weaves these pictures through the Bible.
Yes. All right, question number 2. What can we learn from the events surrounding the transportation of the ark, particularly the tragic incident with Uzzah, 2 Samuel 6, 6-7? And why would an all-knowing God strike Uzzah dead for physically stabilizing the ark when his intentions seemed good? How should we respond when our good intentions are not in line with God's plans or pattern? Ken?
Well, I think we know the story of what happened, and they were transporting this ark on a cart, which was not the way God had told them to do it. And whose decision that was, I have no idea, because it was a dumb decision. But anyway, they were transporting this thing on this cart, and the oxen stumbled, and Uzzah tried to stabilize the ark so it didn't fall, and he was smitten dead. The question is, why would God, an all-knowing God, strike Uzzah dead? Because he had said, do not touch the ark. If you do, you're not going to survive. So.
Okay. So God did what he said he was going to do. April?
I was just going to say, good intentions do not justify unrighteous actions.
Okay. Melissa?
He says what he means, and he means what he says.
Yeah. It's pretty simple. Now, human logic says, how awful. He's protecting the ark. How awful of a thing this is. And it really turned a very joyous occasion into a very somber situation. So, does anybody remember how long the ark has been not present with the people? So, over in 1 Samuel chapter 7, it mentions 20 years. This is before Saul actually is appointed king. And we're told that it's in the house of Aminadab. And so the presence of the Lord has not been with the people for a period of time. I'm not for sure about 1 Samuel 7 when it mentions about 20 years, if that's just like 1 Samuel 7, that whole time period is 20 years. But this is before Saul is made king. How long did Saul reign? 40 years. And then we know that David had reigned 7.5 years in Hebron from 2 Samuel chapter 2, verse 11. So if you add all that time together, it's, to me, what I understand, it's somewhere between 50 and 70 years, because I'm not sure about the whole 20-year thing, but somewhere between 50 and 70 years. All right, so thinking about it in our day and age, like, that means that the ark's been gone since the 50s or the 60s or the 70s. Like, I'm sorry if you were born in the 50s, 60s, or 70s. That's a long time ago that they have been without the ark. And so you've got the people now coming together. You've got the city of David now in Jerusalem and Zion, and this rest that is being given by the Lord, and we're going to bring the ark back, and it is such a joyous thing. And then, wham, Uzzah is killed because of touching it. And as has been mentioned, I mean, God was very specific on how the ark was to be transported, and he was very specific about the fact that it was not to be touched. And so I think about Jesus emphasized how important it is to actually follow instructions over in Matthew chapter 7, 21 through 23. Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but he who does the will of my Father who is in heaven will enter. Many will say to me on that day, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name, and in your name cast out demons, and in your name perform many miracles? And then I will declare to them, I never knew you. Depart from me, you who practice lawlessness. And this is the day and age that we live in. There are so many people that are religiously minded. They have great intentions, but they are not practicing the law. They're not keeping the law. And Jesus says, depart from me, you who practice lawlessness. And so it is something that, yes, regardless of how good our intentions may be, it doesn't justify not keeping God's commandments. Norm?
This was set up by David, and everything surrounding it was them thinking this was a good thing, a good time, this is a great occasion. When nothing about it was honoring God. And so this happened, God does what he says is going to happen, and it showed a lack of faith on Uzzah, or worship of the ark and not of God himself, because if that was God, then he's not going to stumble. So it showed a lack of faith there, showed a lack of faith in what they were doing to begin with. And when it occurs, now the focus is back where it needs to be. It's not this object. It's me and what I have said to do. And it's 3 months before they try this again and do it right.
Yeah, I'd have been scared too.
We're going to do this our way, not God's way, and they thought they were doing a good thing. And it ties right back into what you said with Jesus on the mountain. Like, hey, little people say, hey, I'm doing this for God. This is glorifying God. And God's looking at this one, I don't know anything about you.
I saw another hand. Somebody else want to make a quick comment? All right, so we'll pick up with this. Obviously, we see David's reaction. First he's angry, and then he's scared. So we'll pick up with that next week.